one, what are the priorities? How can we best connect global, regional, and programmatic efforts from high-level policies to implementation on the ground? Great. Okay.
Great, so we're now streaming on YouTube, and I'm going to start the webinar. So I'm going to start broadcasting, which means that people can join and we'll be live. So I suggest we wait for a minute or two to let everybody join and get settled, and then Melissa can take it away. So
will you give me a signal, or should I just wait a couple of minutes and start?
I'm happy to say, right, we're ready to start. Welcome to the webinar. And I'll say a couple of times, we're just waiting for people to join so that people know.
That's great. Thank you.
Great.
Going to get a pen, just a second.
Welcome to everybody who's joining us today. We're just waiting for those that have registered to join, so we'll be starting in another minute or two. Thanks so much for your patience. Welcome everybody. We had a large number of people who registered, so I think we're going to wait just one more minute to allow these people time to join, and then we will kick off the event. Thanks so much. Right, I think we're 4 minutes past the hour. So Melissa, perhaps
Great.
start now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks so much. And welcome everybody to this webinar called A Multilateral Response to Misinformation and Data Transparency, Challenges and Solutions. This webinar is brought to you by the World Health Organization and UN Global Pulse. I'd like to say a couple of words just to start. My name is Melissa Fleming. I lead communications for the UN. And when the COVID-19 crisis hit, it was very clear from the start that this was not just any crisis. It was a public health crisis, but it was a communications crisis as well. And this is because we are having a global pandemic in the social media age, and misinformation that is finding fertile ground. It's ricocheting around the world at record speed, and that is thanks to social media algorithms that favor emotive content. And of course, there is plenty of emotive content when you're dealing with a virus that is hitting everybody and causing illness and death. So basically, we're living in a polluted media landscape where everybody is a publisher. And that means that we have a mixture of what WHO termed at the beginning of this crisis as it's an infodemic. What's an infodemic? An infodemic is when you have good information mixed with bad information. And the problem for the public is they have a hard time navigating and figuring out which is good and which is bad. I'm sure we're going to get into all of that in this discussion. I just wanted to note, to set the scene, a recent YouGov Cambridge Globalism Project survey in collaboration with The Guardian newspaper of 26,000 people in 25 countries found that the most believed conspiracy around COVID-19 is that the death rate from the virus has been deliberately and greatly exaggerated. How can this happen, really? How can there be conspiracies about the vaccine, which are running rampant as soon as the good news came out about promising vaccines, that really this was all a plot to insert chips into people's bodies to control the world, or that this vaccine would alter our DNA? How can we collectively work to improve our information and media environment to protect freedom of speech and media, but while at the same time ensuring the public has access to good information? I'd love to hear what this group here can tell us about this and other topics that are related. I'm very pleased to introduce the speakers. Tina Bernat, who is a senior expert from WHO's Science Division; Stefan Liller, who is a UNDP resident representative in Uruguay; Guilherme Canella, who is the Chief Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists section. He's the chief at the Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalism journalist section in the Communication and Information sector of UNESCO. My colleague Miguel Luengo Oroz, who is the Chief Data Scientist of UN Global Pulse; Jeremy West, who is the Senior Policy Analyst, Directorate for Science and Innovation at OECD; and last but not least, Christina Stump, who is the head of the Unit Media Convergence and Social Media of the Directorate General Communications Networks, Content and Technology from the European Union. Christina, you have a long title. So I'd like to now begin with our panel discussion. And I'm going to start with one question to Tina and Jeremy. And Tina and Jeremy, I went through the introductions very quickly. So at the start of your answer to my question, if you can just remind people what you do and who you work for. So my first question is, how are the United Nations and multilateral agencies responding to this misinformation and disinformation crisis that I just described? And how are you doing it within your particular mandates? Tina Pernot from WHO. Could you start?
Yes, thank you very much. So my name is Tina Pernot. I work in the Digital Health and Innovation Department in the Science Division in WHO headquarters in Geneva. And since March, I've been part of a multidisciplinary team in WHO that is responding to the COVID-19 infodemic. So at WHO, we early on in the pandemic recognized that we're not only dealing with the pandemic, but also with an infodemic that Melissa described. We built on previous experience from outbreaks and health emergencies where we've seen that an infodemic, so this overabundance of information during a health emergency, that this can overwhelm people with information, and this may then lead to confusion or anxiety and inaction. And this information tsunami also contains misinformation, which can also cause real harm. We know from previous experience that infodemics can intensify or lengthen outbreaks if enough people change their behavior based on either lack of trust in health response or health authorities, or due to misinformation that they hear. So one of key functions of health authorities is to ensure that there is high quality health information available about questions and concerns people are asking. So WHO has worked on this in the COVID-19 infodemic response through efforts to translate evidence and science into clear information and messages that could then be taken up by partners to disseminate them widely. And we have partnered up across society to co-create messages and amplify their reach. And we've also intensified partnerships with the technology sector, social media platforms, media, and our UN system agencies to best disseminate these messages and to train partners to better disseminate COVID-19 messages. Now, at the same time, we've also complemented these efforts with a recognition that we need an evidence-based response to the infodemic and to health misinformation. As Melissa mentioned, this is the first pandemic of the 21st century and of the modern digitized society. Information travels fast globally. It affects our lives offline, even in those communities that are not directly using internet, but they may be using mobile phones, and they are affected by the media cycle that is fueled by online information economy. So we know that messaging itself is not enough to encourage people to enact health behaviors, and especially not during health emergency situations. Many other factors feed into a person's decision, whether to wear a mask or to follow public health guidance, or even decide to accept the COVID-19 vaccine. So we've been working along 4 streams. First, after a massive online consultation in April, we put forward a call for action with 50 actions that partners across whole of society can take to help respond to the COVID-19 infodemic. Second, over the summer, we convened scientists from over 14 disciplines to help us review what evidence is available in analysis and also design of interventions that can help reduce harm from the infodemic and encourage health behaviors. And this resulted in a public health research agenda for managing infodemics. Third, we've been developing country tools and partnerships to better practically serve the country needs. And fourth, we recognized the urgent need to operationalize the response to the COVID-19 infodemic in countries. And we have just delivered the first infodemic manager training, among other things. Now, in conclusion, the key takeaway here would be that the infodemic is not only a public communication or digital technology problem. It's a challenge at a human level of human behavior. So as we work on ensuring that people can access and find high quality health information in the information ecosystem, and as we support debunking efforts against health misinformation, we also need to ask ourselves, what else? So we're also asking ourselves, what else do we need to do to empower communities and individuals with information and knowledge that they can protect themselves from harm and that they can be resilient to health misinformation? And what else can we do to pre-bunk misinformation, to deliver health information past the human brain's cognitive biases that make us so vulnerable to misinformation, and to promote literacy through social inoculation efforts? And what else can we do so that high quality health information can more successfully compete with health misinformation, which is normally, as Melissa mentioned, very slickly produced, emotive. It's playing on people's reactions to promote sharing of this content, both by people and by content promotion algorithms. And what else can we do to measure and know what interventions have worked and which ones didn't? This is where data transparency and metrics are really key. So these questions still need answering, and we're at the same time we're responding to COVID-19 infodemic, and of course the health and societal and economic impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic has on the world. So I'm really pleased to be on this panel to discuss this from our different mandates and perspectives, and to join in the response to the infodemic. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Tina. And I think your point about the challenge of addressing the infodemic when it's all about human behavior, and finding strategies that go beyond just publishing information. I'm aware of a recent study by First Draft News that looked at Facebook posts around the vaccine recently, and they've noticed that there's a data deficit, and I think there have been other studies there as well. So I think one of the big problems for us is, and what we're at the UN are trying to change, is that the good information is there, the science-based content is there. WHO has great content, as do the other agencies, public health organizations. It's just that the more entertaining, more emotive knows how to travel through the algorithms much better than our PDFs, where maybe the nugget of information people are searching for is on a page 125. And so we at the UN are also really trying through our project called Verified to take the public health guidance from WHO, from others, and produce it into socially optimized nuggets of content that are traveling in the same spaces that the misinformation is traveling, and but send people to the right direction. So thank you very much for that. And also to respond to this question, I'm going to ask Gulham Canella from UNESCO to come in. And again, the question is, what are you doing at UNESCO? What policy considerations are you working on to try to combat this infodemic and polluted media and information landscape? Over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. That's a very interesting debate, and I guess that from the UNESCO perspective, obviously for our mandate on freedom of expression and media freedoms, we have been concerned about the phenomena of disinformation and misinformation from a long time now, when the impacts were previously on elections, or for instance, decisions in accepting science related to climate change, for instance. And obviously during this year with the pandemic, all this has been exacerbated. So a few elements from UNESCO. First, this idea that it's to define policy responses, we need to better understand the challenges of this so complex digital ecosystem. So the UNESCO member states they have approved a comprehensive framework that we called ROAM, that these policies related to address those challenges in these very complex media ecosystems should be based on 4 basic principles. R for rights, so our policy should be human rights based. Secondly, openness. We still need to try to guarantee the openness of the architecture of the internet. Third element, accessibility to the network in many ways, not only the accessibility to the grid, but then accessibility related to multilingualisms or with people with disabilities. And fourth element, those decisions, those policy decisions should be most stakeholder driven. So we need to involve the different relevant stakeholders here, the governments, the platforms, the civil society organizations, the internet expert community in taking those decisions. So for this, one key aspect that Tina has already mentioned is the aspect of definitions. So we need to be very clear on what we are talking about, and it's not every time so easy because we are mixing different things. For instance, we sometimes are mixing the idea of disinformation with hate speech, with conspiracy theories. All those things, they have points in common, but they also demand different responses from the international human rights law perspective. So we need to really underline that the responses for those different phenomena are also different responses, at least from the international legal perspective. And for instance, in the terms of the more directly policy regulation side of the story, we need to be very careful in always guarantee that any policy complies with the triple test that the restrictions to freedom of expression and access to information demands, or in the case of hate speech, the 6-part Habat test for taking decisions and in terms of restricting content that potentially involves hate speech, and so on and so forth. So this from the policy perspective, the idea of looking into the human rights agenda is quite essential. And this is very much related to another policy element that UNESCO is underlining together with the other agencies, that is the capacity building perspective of this. So we are talking about the capacity building, for instance, of regulators, electoral managerial bodies, or judges and prosecutors, or the telecom regulators. So we need to interact with these people so that the policy response, again, is in line with international law, particularly in terms of freedom of expression and access to information. But then we have another element that Tina also already mentioned, that is the element of empowering the citizens. And you also mentioned, Melissa, when mentioning the Verify campaign. So long-term policies in terms of media and information literacy, so empowering the educational systems so that citizens in all levels they are able to interact with this brave new world in a way that it's a critical interaction, knowing how to identify the chains of disinformation and misinformation is quite relevant here. Or working, for instance, with social media influencers and how they can also help in this interaction with the citizens. But here we need to be very careful for not blaming the victim. No, there is a risk in these strategies that we take the solution from empowering the citizens at the same level as changing very complex structures and powerful structures, that is the case of the platforms. So obviously the balancing of those rights and what the citizens are actually capable of do should be all the time under our radar. And that comes to the other element of UNESCO response, that is, we are really looking forward to enhance transparency and accountability related to the internet companies. How can we put this dialogue on the table? As you all said in the beginning, to build evidence, to build policy based on evidences, we need to have more access to the data, and most of the data is related to the flux of information and disinformation in the platforms. And until now, unfortunately, we don't know exactly what's going on. So it's very difficult to build evidence-based policy when we are in this kind of situation that the platforms are not sharing critical information for taking decisions. And finally, in this initial remarks here regarding what UNESCO is doing in terms of policy, overall, we need more freedom of expression and more access to information and not less to tackle this problem. So one of the key policy elements here, for instance, are how can we deal with the issue of media viability? We probably will facing the phenomenon of media deserts until the end of the year if the issue of media viability is not addressed. requests, or how can we enhance access to information policies in our member states instead of reducing access to information. So overall, we need to have more freedom of expression, more access to information to tackle those such complex phenomena. So I will leave it there and glad to further discuss in the next steps of this debate. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Guilherme. That's fascinating. And I think we could have an entire webinar around your last point, the need for more freedom of expression and access and not less, and also the dangers of fighting misinformation and disinformation with regulation. What implications does that have to freedom of the media? Again, yeah, with freedom of expression, we're seeing though is coming freedom of bad information. So the media literacy part that you pointed out, I think is especially also something important for us at the UN, and we're working on delivering through our verified campaign. So it's great working with you also on it, your colleagues at UNESCO. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to, wait a minute, let me make sure I'm in the right order. Turn to the next question, and that is to Christina. Oh, wait a minute, sorry, I have, no, I have, yes. I think before we had Jeremy West. I think I might have skipped. I am very sorry. I skipped. Nobody in the audience will know that I just skipped the order, but I think we'll turn now to Jeremy West, who's a senior policy analyst at the OECD, who will also help us to answer this question. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Melissa. I'm Jeremy West, and I work in the OECD's Digital Economy Policy Division, where we pay particular attention to online platforms, which, as you know, are on the front lines regarding mis and disinformation on the internet. But I'd just like to say that the OECD appreciates that the WHO and UN Global Pulse reached out to us on this topic. We agree that a coordinated multilateral approach is needed, and we're happy to work with our partners in WHO, UNESCO, in the EU and other jurisdictions to address this issue. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about some of the work that the OECD is carrying out as part of its response to mis and disinformation, particularly on COVID-19. Back in March, the OECD's Secretary General decided that it was crucial for the organization to apply its human resources rapidly to the many policy challenges that the virus was presenting and still is. And so he called on staff to start producing a series of short, targeted policy briefs addressing different aspects of the problem. Meanwhile, the machinery of our committee structure also began to engage and produce longer reports. So fast forwarding to today, we now have 162 policy briefs on our website tackling coronavirus, and more are coming online every 1 or 2 days. So far, 2 of those briefs are specifically about mis and disinformation. The first one, which is called Combating COVID-19 Disinformation on Online Platforms, is about the role of the platforms as key vectors of mis and disinformation online, as well as their role as key defenders against it. And it contains some recommended steps that platforms and governments can take to counter it. I'll probably get into those specific recommendations in response to a later question, so I'm tucking that away for now. The other policy brief I wanted to mention is about the role of public communication in responding to the wave of disinformation on the coronavirus. And that one contains examples of how governments are leveraging public communication to counteract disinformation and support policy measures against COVID-19. It offers some preliminary guidelines on how governments can best engage with citizens during the crisis. We also have some policy briefs that concern data transparency, which I wanted to mention since that subject is part of this event too. And those include one called Ensuring Data Privacy as We Battle COVID-19. That brief acknowledges that it's vital to make accurate data on infections, deaths, hotspots, etc., available to researchers and the public, but that it's also vital to protect individuals' right to privacy. So that brief offers advice on how policymakers, in consultation with privacy enforcement authorities, can best assess the trade-offs in data use and data sharing during the pandemic. And then the last brief I'll talk about is called Tracking and Tracing COVID. And that one is about the innovative ways that mobile and biometric technologies are being used to improve the quality, quantity, and variety of data and information available, again, with an eye on how best to capture, share, and use it without infringing privacy rights. So moving on to some of the longer reports now, I'd like to mention that the entire forthcoming edition of one of the OECD's flagship publications called the Science, Technology, and Innovation Outlook will focus on COVID-19. And it's going to include a chapter on how governments can reinforce public trust in policy measures through science specifically. Openness and transparency of the data behind the science that's informing measures such as mask and social distancing requirements is of course important for ensuring trust and compliance. But as many of you know, if not all of you, sometimes scientists have to communicate incomplete and changing evidence. And when they do, it has to be done in a way that navigates the hazards of mis and disinformation. So the trick is acknowledging the uncertainties without feeding the mistrust in scientific advice. And that's what we're going to address there in that chapter. We also published a report this past summer on digital capacity and skills for data-intensive science, which makes the point that while data transparency, open data, and data sharing are essential, including in the fight against COVID, they're not enough by themselves. Simply making data available doesn't really increase transparency or reproducibility unless you have people on the receiving end that have the right skills to use it. So the focus of that report is on research and academia, but its reasoning carries over to broader society and the importance of basic digital and scientific literacy as well. And then the last one I wanted to mention was also issued over the summer and is called Governance Responses to Disinformation. That one suggests a holistic range of governance responses to disinformation, including on COVID-19, resting on the open government principles of transparency, integrity, accountability, and stakeholder participation. It focuses on 4 types of interventions: public communication, direct actions to identify and combat disinformation, legal and regulatory policy, and media and civic responses to support better information ecosystems. So I think I'll stop there, but I want to thank you again for the question and the opportunity.
Wow, I think, Jeremy, we could also do an entire webinar with just you and all of the information contained in your policy briefs. I think what I would like to ask, and I see Nicole, who is tuned in, has also asked this question: is it possible in the chat if you could provide the links to these policy briefs so people have the chance to delve deeper? That would be fantastic. And it's great to see the OECD doing this kind of work. And fantastic, great, and we'll come back to you a little bit later as well. As you indicated, now I would be very happy to turn the floor to Christina Stump, who is from the European Union. She's going to introduce herself, and again on the question of what policy considerations are being developed and implemented and how are they working. Christina, over to you.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much. I am in the lead of the unit behind a long name that is addressing, among other aspects, also the disinformation phenomenon. And as already highlighted by other speakers, disinformation as such is not a new phenomenon, and it's not now that the Commission started to look into it. However, the current health crisis has indeed highlighted how much harm disinformation can cause. And it has, I think, even more highlighted that there is important work to be done in this area. As mentioned at the Commission, we have already started to look into addressing the disinformation phenomenon from 2018, developing an overarching strategy to tackle disinformation. And in addition, I will also mention that now we are also looking into specific aspects related to the COVID-19 related disinformation crisis. And to keep in mind that disinformation is a complex phenomena. Also, very often, or more often than not, it is not illegal information, and that keeping the freedom of information, the freedom of speech in mind always when addressing this phenomenon is absolutely important. Also, given the complexity of the phenomenon, it is very important to note that there is no one magic bullet to address this information. There are several elements in that we are looking into when forming the policy response, and also as stressed, in order to have a good response, several actors have to work together to address this issue. Our initiatives or our strategies at the European Commission have several elements. One of the key pillars is the so-called Code of Practice on Disinformation. That is a self-regulatory code with the participation of major platforms. But we have also initiatives that support the fact-checking and the research community. We have also actions related to media literacy, and we have also research projects that are, for example, funding technology that helps to debunk fake videos or fake pictures. So these already show that we are developing a quite complex policy on this. Let me turn a little bit to this code of practice, because this has also proven very useful when it comes to the COVID-19 related disinformation crisis. This code of practice is quite a world premiere, so to say. Europe has been the first one to come up with these initiatives, and it has basically the several platforms, some of the biggest platforms that are signatories of the code and have committed to work on these commitments, such as Facebook, Google, Twitter, Mozilla, Microsoft, and also recently TikTok joined. So with that, we already cover quite some platforms. Also, this code of practice contains several elements, again, not one magic bullet, but for example, it has elements regarding prioritizing authentic content. I will come to that, also related to the COVID crisis. It has transparency measures. It commits to develop tools that people can use to identify news that can be false, fact-checking, other tools as also more transparency to identify fake accounts and automated bots, and take measures regarding that. It also looks into the monetization of disinformation through advertising placements, And it has also important measures regarding media literacy, improving critical thinking that was already outlined. And it also contains indeed commitments to share information with the research community, which was also an aspect that is indeed important and was also stressed by other panelists. This is not a complete description of the code, but just to point to some of the elements. And turning specifically to the COVID-19 crisis, we have also seen that the signatories of the code have implemented the code and has already given some results in this regard. For example, when promoting accurate and authoritative information related to the crisis, for example, pointing to information from the World Health Organization, or platforms have demoted content that is fact-checked as false or misleading, or they have limited ads that promote false products or services. Also, in accordance with their terms and conditions, platforms have also removed content that could harm citizens' health or affect public safety. So also to look more into this COVID-19 related phenomenon, the Commission has also published a communication that has really looked more specifically to address this. And also it has set up a monitoring scheme with platforms where platforms monthly report about all the actions that they are taking related to COVID-19 related disinformation. These reports are publicly available. I am also happy to share the link to the chat, because this contains very good examples what platforms are already doing to address COVID-19 related disinformation. Here, as we are in this panel, just to give a few examples what platforms have reported about. These are, for example, really putting information panels that are directing the users to the World Health Organization or national health authorities, really working together with fact checkers, also marking videos in diverse ways and directing people to authoritative information. These are really elements that have proven very important in this regard, and you can also consult how many people have been actually reached through these information panels, through fact-checking and so on. So these strategy regarding monitoring has already brought results. It doesn't mean, of course, that there is not more to be done. And certainly one aspect that we also note from the Commission side is the importance to share data with researchers to have more information available on this phenomenon. Also, just to mention very quickly the other element, because here we are speaking about the collaboration with the platform. So indeed, that is a very important element as they are major stakeholder in this regard. But as mentioned, we are also, for example, helping the fact-checking and research community through the project SOMA that has now basically taken a new turn with EDMO, the European Digital Media Observatory. For example, SOMA has already looked into COVID-19 related disinformation, for example, 5G related disinformation. This can be also interesting research to look into this. And EDMO will also help in the future through the creation of national hubs to be more present, also closer to the citizens, to give more support in this regard. And as mentioned, media literacy is also a very important part of the Commission's initiatives. So there is also an important emphasis to support activities at member states level, also on the level of the European Commission. So this would be a little bit the overview what the Commission's policy response is in general related to disinformation, and then related to COVID-19 related disinformation. And I would be also happy later to share also what may come in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina. I think it's very interesting for people to hear about the code that the European Commission has developed, and if that's publicly available, if you could share that in the chat, and also the publication that you indicated. I think it's very interesting to hear how the Commission has influenced the platforms in their suppressing or demoting or limiting or removing content. I think we would all be keen to get more data from the platform so we can make our own analyses. But I think this is all, it shows the depth and the breadth of the work that the Commission has been doing. So thank you very much for your intervention. I'd next like to turn to Stefan Liller, who is our UNDP, UN Development Program representative in Uruguay. And the question here is, more from, you're on the ground in a member country of the United Nations. And so what is being done there, and what lessons can we draw from your experience? Over to you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and a big thank you also to WHO and the Global Pulse for organizing this webinar and for inviting us. And of course, greetings to everyone on the panel and those of you who are connected today. Right, Melissa, I would like to bring down and talk a little bit about how we as UNDP and as a UN system have worked with misinformation, disinformation on a country level. And I would need to roll back the tape for about 1.5 years, almost 2 years, where our journey begins, so to speak. And it's in connection with the parliamentary and the presidential election of 2019 in Uruguay. Essentially in March, April that year, when campaigning started in earnest for the elections, we started noting how an increased number of, at the time, was referred to as fake news were popping up around candidates, around parties. And we started being concerned and discussing this with different stakeholders and colleagues, listening what people were doing on the topic. Together with UNESCO and others, we came together with the Association of Uruguayan Press, a couple of NGOs and other organizations, with the idea of promoting the signature of an ethical pact between all the political parties, not to engage and discourage any type of disinformation and misinformation around the political process and around the candidates and the other parties. And this pact was signed in the end of April 2019 with the participation of the whole kind of political establishment in Uruguay, including the sitting vice president, former presidents, all the political parties, candidates and others. That same day in the morning that the pact was signed in Parliament, together with UNESCO, we brought together a number of stakeholders in a closed kind of an informal discussion at the UNDP office to talk about disinformation, misinformation in the context of the elections. And we had, the platforms came in, so we had Facebook, Twitter, and Google, representative of civil society, all the political parties, the electoral court. We had different members from media, written media, radio, TV, to kind of sit and share information on what everybody was doing to deal with disinformation and misinformation. And I think, at least in the Uruguayan context, this was the first time that all these stakeholders sat together. And many, it was the first time they actually met somebody physically that worked for Facebook or Twitter or Google. So it was very, very interesting, and also to hear the perspectives from each of these different stakeholders, how they saw the problem and how they were dealing with it, and how we could come together to do things together in that sense. So following this and following the signing of the pact, there was a lot of noise in the media, a lot of talk. There was a lot of follow-up interviews and discussions, which kind of brought about a number of other developments at the local level. For example, something called Verificado UI, a verifications service was set up by the platform and a number of media outlets. Together with UNESCO on the platforms, we organize capacity building and training, both for media, but also for different institutions at the central level, at the regional level, at the local level. How do you deal with disinformation? You know, what are different tools that you can use? How does the platforms work? So kind of a very hands-on type of work that we were doing up until the October 2019 elections. And then in the context of the unfolding pandemic in March this year, we saw that this was also an issue that would have, we thought, great impact also in terms of the COVID. So we again kind of reached out to our partners from the previous year, and UNESCO being one of them. We produced a number of spots for social media, for the platforms, on how to avoid disinformation, that were then translated into a number of different languages by our country offices, both in this region and in other regions. And this initiative was also even highlighted on the World Press Freedom Day this year by the UN as a good practice also of pushing awareness. And in April this year, under the leadership of UNESCO and WHO, actually, they had developed a massive they were developing a massive open online course and invited us to join them on journalism in a pandemic, kind of covering how you cover COVID and the different aspects of that, with a lot of focus around disinformation and misinformation. So we participated in developing this, also with some socioeconomic content, which is the impact of COVID on the socioeconomic aspects, which is more in our mandate, and making a specific model for Latin America and the Caribbean. So this course was run in May, and more than 9,000 people from 162 countries participated, most of them students of journalism or journalists graduated and working journalists. And then in August this year, again, you know, we had regional and local elections planned. So we had another round of getting together the political establishment with the Uruguayan Press Association, UNDP and UNESCO, and they kind of re-signed another pact to work against disinformation in the elections. So those are the initial things. Now what we are doing is that we are working on a local level with a number of different organizations to try and look at a couple of other issues related to content moderation, freedom of expression, and democratic governance. So far, we've had a number of national dialogues with civil society, with academia, and with the media on on content management. So, for example, there's very little knowledge we noticed in these dialogues of how the platforms work, the logarithms. If you publish something, who sees it, who doesn't see it? If you have a problem, your content is taken down, where do you go? So what we're trying to do now is at a local level are trying to get a good discussion and a good understanding of these issues, hopefully to get us spurring a discussion at a Latin American level around these issues, because it seems that in different regions there's different maturity in terms of, you know, how much knowledge is out there, but also the terms of reference and conditions that the different platforms have in the different regions differ. So what we're trying to do now is to have a discussion on the content moderation part of this. So I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And I think everybody will probably like the idea of a pact, which shows the number of players that need to be involved in order to tackle this, but also that how the genie came out of the bottle before everybody was prepared. And now we're all catching up, I think, and even educating about you know, how the platforms work, how information travels in the digital age, and yeah, how we can navigate this at the local and regional levels, and yeah, the different I think preparedness of different countries is something also to consider. And it's, you know, the European Commission can do something Europe-wide, but it's probably much more of a challenge for you there in Latin America. So thank you very much for those insights. And last but not least in this round, before I go to the final, just asking everybody to look to the future, I'd like to ask Miguel to come in, who is our Chief Data Scientist at UN Global Pulse. And maybe Miguel, also just a few words for everybody's sake on what UN Global Pulse is. Over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. Really happy to be here. So at UN Global Pulse is the AI and Big Data Innovation unit from the Secretary General, and we support the UN United Nations system and member states working or using new tools based on the digital world, on artificial intelligence to do better your job. Okay, and since the beginning of the pandemic, we have been trying to really taking a very pragmatic approach and working together with the World Health Organization, with UNESCO, with UNDP and other agencies and alliance like Africa Infodemic Response Alliance to provide the tools that can help have a better response. Because, I mean, as we have said, the reality is that this is a digital epidemic and this has two characteristics. It travels really fast and goes at scale. So if we're gonna counter this, and we're going to catch the genius that now is out of the bottle, we need to use the best tools. So, I mean, one of the first things which for us was like a straightforward. So you need to be able to quantify the size of this misinformation. I mean, and one example, back in April, we started to monitor in the networks rumors around COVID organics, herbs that could cure COVID, together with our teams in Africa. We found more than 100,000 mentions coming from more than 50,000 people and bots. Okay, and that was like the first month. The second month, that turned down to 10% of that. So, but just the ability to monitor is like one tool we need to have, and it's like the starting of building the foundations of having these data-driven policies. Tools or digital tools can also help us to do the triage of all these messages that are coming. That sometimes, I mean, we don't know, we are not able to funnel them all, even if we work together with fact-checking organizations. I think also we need to go one level up in terms of how we design our campaigns to pass this public health information. I mean, the advertising industry has gone far, like using A/B testing and things like that, but we need to use also these tools to pass our messages. I think that that's important. And I also would like to share another experience, because we have said a lot about platforms and social networks, but there are many places in the world where people are getting information from different data sources, from different places, like radio. Okay, so this is one of the sources of information we have been like working on, and essentially what we are trying to do is what we're doing is using artificial intelligence to somehow automatically analyze public radio stations in different countries to find out what is being said about COVID, okay, which are like the topics, which are like the rumors, which are traveling in the radio wavelengths together with the discussion on COVID. So to give you an idea, in for instance, one African country, out of 300 hours of radio discussions, like 3 hours were about COVID. In Latin America, in one Latin American country, also we have seen that there are about more than 50 programs per day that talk about COVID and something else. Sometimes it's misinformation. So we also need to make the efforts to make sure that we leave no voice behind. Okay, and here we're talking about there are 7,000 languages, 1,000 languages with more than 100,000 native speakers. There are less than 100 languages for which we have like digital tools, and the UN is translating to 6 languages. So I think we really need to make an effort to pass the right information to in all these languages, but also make sure that we are working together with local organizations and providing the tools they need to support and to filter out and really answer those questions. When also I may be building on what Melissa, you started to say, and Tina and Jeremy, I think you all mentioned that. So we are in the digital infodemic, and in my head, I have this analogy. And if you want, in the epidemic, the virus spread through the air, the droplets or aerosols, but our misinformation is spreading through the media and the social media platform. Okay, these are the mechanics. And what we're saying, like super spreading events, we're having viral facts. where we are saying like transmission indoors. Maybe this is the bubble filters that we are having in the platforms, where we're saying, I mean, our fact checkers, maybe they are like doing the treatment, and vaccines is public health information campaigns, antibodies is, I mean, our own behaviors. I think we can make the analogy. And by making the analogy, I realized that over these months, we have done a lot of research on the epidemic side, but much less rigorous multidisciplinary research on the infodemic front. Okay, and I think this is something that, I mean, we're trying to do, and as Tina said, I mean, this research community is being mobilized, but this is where I think we can do more.
Thank you so much, Miguel, for those insights on your work. And I think it is your analogies are great. Yes, the virus, the misinformation is traveling. We're saying sometimes it's traveling faster than the virus, and there are these super spreader events, and there are the influencers who are sometimes even, you know, discredited by virologists, coupled with slick production companies who manage to create media that are so much, you know, more, let's say, attractive than some of the things that we're able to produce. I think you made a really important point about the languages and tracking also non-traditional forms of media, where in many parts of the world, especially radio, people get their information. And really the point of having the capacity to do the kind of research so that we really know what kind of problem we're facing. What is the, you know, how bad is the misinformation? What is the nature of it? How are people receiving the information? And then how can we, and this is our aspiration at the UN, you know, partnering with all of you to be that source of information for public good that is based on science and information people can trust. So thank you very much for that. And now for the final round, I would like to ask all speakers briefly to talk about, you know, what are your priorities for 2021? We're already talking about 2021. Yes, tomorrow is December. So we can. And how can we best connect global, regional, and local programmatic areas from high-level policies to implementation on the ground? You can, you know, adapt your answer to this question as you will, but I think, Miguel, you're still front and center on the screen, so I'm going to go back to front, and I'm going to put you up first since we just had you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Melissa. So, I mean, I'm going to continue with analogy because I think something else is, I mean, something very critical here is what the masks. Okay, the masks are being critical in the control of the epidemic, but we really don't know what are the masks in the infodemic. And probably the masks had to do with how the social media companies, how the companies are moderating, are filtering the messages. Okay, how those algorithms are proposing the next recommendation. So I guess what I expect to happen in the next year, and I think we need, as a society, I mean, and we have to push this from the UN, but also from every stakeholder. We need to have more algorithmic transparency. We need to understand, I mean, how this filtering, how this moderation of the information is happening. Will you wear a FFP2 mask that has no certification? No, I mean, we need to understand how they are working. Okay, so I think for me, that is like one of the things I hope to see over the next year is really more algorithmic transparency and working together with platforms to understand what's really going on and how all these machine learning algorithms are helping or taking the decisions for us and are taking the spread, I mean, are motivating the spread of this information. On the other hand, I guess that my other wish, or we're going to focus on Global Plus next year, is really bridging the gap between research and implementation. We need, as we try new things, we need to deploy them on the ground. We cannot wait. I mean, and this is going to be really critical as we unfold the vaccine rollout. So we will encourage, and we want to encourage, and this is an open call for researchers, for multidisciplinary researchers, to help us build the science on the infodemic and apply it over.
No, thank you, Miguel. And I think that's particularly important. I can't believe we've been speaking for over an hour and we haven't really touched on the vaccine. And just to note that we are, and I know WHO and UNICEF are all engaged in vaccine confidence building through communications and looking at behavioral science. But we would love to, take that point that we can't wait. We can't wait. The vaccine's ready to go. We need enough people to take it in order for it to work, for us to reach herd immunity. And there are mushrooming conspiracies and misinformation and disinformation about the vaccines on social media. So no time to wait. And yeah, any help that we can get also with the research is important. I'd like to now go to Stefan, because I'm going in reverse order. What are you hoping for 2021, Stefan?
Thank you, Melissa. Well, I hope that we will continue working much more on the issue that we started a couple of months ago around content moderation, which a lot of the colleagues have also mentioned, and doing that from a national point of view here in Uruguay with different stakeholders, and hopefully bringing that discussion to a regional level as well. I also hope that 2021 will see more collaboration with more entities. I mean, in the UN, we are very, very good at collaborating with our sister agencies, but I would hope that these discussions, which today's webinar sets a good precedent, that we will also work much more closely on a local level, on a national level, with the EU, with the World Bank, other multilateral banks, other international organizations to deal with this together. Yes, so basically those two, the content moderation, more discussions, more work on discussion on a national level, and much more collaboration with other global and regional partners on the local level to bringing down some of these excellent policy notes, and so that colleagues have mentioned today, to the national level. That I hope happens in 2000.
Great. Well, yes, I think the message is we need global and regional to be successful locally, and probably for us to be successful globally, we need really the information from what's happening on the ground, and as well as the implementation. So thanks very much, Stefan, and good luck. And now I'd like to ask Christina to come back and tell us what you're hoping for from the perspective of the European Commission for 2021.
Yes, absolutely. So the elements that I mentioned, the code of practice on disinformation, its monitoring, support to the fact-checking community, researchers, and media literacy will remain important. However, let me already mention 3 concrete things for that you don't even have to wait until 2021. They will come up still in December, in the coming days. So first of all, to vaccines, indeed, that is also a very important issue for the Commission, and in view of the important that once, and we are hopefully very close, safe vaccine is available, people are not influenced by disinformation, we have asked platforms to also report about their initiatives related to vaccines-related disinformation. So the next round of the monitoring reports will be published in a few days, and there we have asked platforms to report specifically also related to steps taken related to vaccines-related disinformation. Then on more overarching initiatives from the Commissions, 2 will be coming out also in the coming days. One is the European Democracy Action Plan that will be published on the 2nd of December, and it will also contain measures to step up the fight against disinformation, among other elements. And then, as you also may be aware, on the 9th of December, the Commission is also due to publish its long-awaited Digital Services Act that will be a harmonized framework or a more horizontal approach regarding to platforms regulation. So I think all these 3 elements will be important to have adequate policy responses at the level of the EU to all these phenomena that we have discussed today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Christina, and good luck. And I think the EU has been a real forerunner in making the platforms feel uncomfortable. So Yeah, and steering them into action. So it's great to see, and that would be interesting also to see your findings on the vaccine misinformation that they are reporting to you. So that would be great if you could share that. Jeremy, you have popped up on the screen. It looks like you're ready to go with that beautiful backdrop from somewhere in Paris, I guess.
Indeed, yeah, that's the OECD headquarters.
It's OECD. Oh, okay. Good.
Yeah,
Virtual,
well, we don't have a snowy day
OECD.
today. Exactly. Well, thanks for the opportunity to chime in. Other people have already mentioned my top item on the wish list for 2021, but I think I might put a slightly different spin on it. So it is to call on online platforms to improve their transparency reporting on mis and disinformation. But to do it in a way that is not only more common, but more consistent from company to company. So the OECD, as you probably know, is a big believer in evidence-based policymaking, but that requires a good base of evidence. And so far, we don't have that because there is no widespread or consistent transparency reporting from the platforms on disinformation. Regular transparency updates from them about their policies, what their policies are towards defining misinformation and disinformation, on how much of it is showing up and being viewed, how they detect it and moderate it, would help researchers and policymakers and the platforms themselves to identify ways to make improvements. And a common approach is so important because it's the only way to get a cross-industry or cross-platform perspective. So we're actually trying to build an international consensus, a multi-stakeholder consensus right now at the OECD on a framework for transparency reporting of terrorist and violent extremist content online. And if there were a mandate for it, we could do the same kind of thing with respect to disinformation too, since we sort of have a playbook going on that. Just really quickly, numbers 2 and 3. 2 would be to offer more support to a diverse range of independent fact-checking organizations. And number 3 would be to focus on improving users' media, digital, and health literacy skills. Because people just, they need better skills to safely and competently navigate what they're seeing online, including how to verify the content's accuracy and distinguish real news from opinion and propaganda. That's something that requires collaboration between media organizations and governments, health organizations, platforms, and educators. So I'd like to see more of that happening in 2021 also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I think that's an incredibly important point. The role the fact-checking organizations are playing is probably under-recognized, and they need more support, as does the media, and which is also unfortunately suffering a lot at the same time in this digital age. And obviously media literacy, I think we all believe in that. And there's absolutely many more tools we can give individuals to be able to defend themselves in this dangerous media ecosystem. So thank you very much for that. Guilherme Canela, would you like to come in, please?
Yes, thank you.
2021 for you in UNESCO.
Thank you. No, I mean, I think I'm very glad that we are converging on our wish list for 2021, because the phenomenon is so complex and so difficult to tackle that we will need to prioritize and create synergies and optimizations around a very concrete set of goals for 2021. And I fully agree with the colleagues that one of those goals is the transparency issue. I would add to what Jeremy just said, that we all apparently we are all in favor of transparency. This is this kind of omnibus concept that no one is against, but this is also very dangerous, because if we don't go into the details, then we don't move forward. So I think we need to really start discussing seriously what is transparency related to the platforms, and then looking into the details, like what are the transparency, for instance, related to their advertisement policy, and how this impacts elections or impacts other areas, or what are, as Jeremy already said, the transparency related to the content moderation or the terms and conditions, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the first goal is that we really go deeper into the discussion of the transparency. The other element that is related to this, and the others already mentioned, I do think it's absolutely fundamental that we increase our cooperation as multilateral organizations within the UN system, and also with the other friendly international governmental organizations, and putting on the table our advantage values. So I think we need to understand better, for instance, the impact of disinformation on economy. So our colleagues from OECD can help a lot with that, but also the economical commissions and the banks, as Stefan said, and the impacts on elections. So then the colleagues from UNDP or from the ICMEA can help a lot, et cetera, or in children, the UNICEF can help a lot, and obviously vaccines and health in general, as our colleagues from WHO can help a lot. And then a third, let's say, it's not in my wish list, because we are going to do it, is a scoop for you guys, with our colleague from World Health Organization and the Knight Center. We will work again in a similar MOOC strategies, as Stefan has mentioned, for the overall coverage of pandemic. But very soon we will offer a MOOC in several languages about for helping journalists in covering the challenge of vaccination. So this will, as Stefan mentioned, we launched this year a MOOC that 9,000 journalists from 162 countries were enrolled in several languages, and now we will offer a similar strategy for the coverage of vaccines. So hope this will be useful for all the stakeholders involved. Over to you.
Thank you. That's really great to hear. And I think all of us, thanks, maybe this webinar maybe brought the multilateral organizations together, and I think we should continue to cooperate and define transparency, and also maybe come together on what our asks are for the platforms. Just to take this opportunity before I go finally to Tina, to note that we've also developed, as part of my team's Verified initiative and with the University of Florida, a practitioner's guide for communicators based on the best communication science, behavioral science, working with Heidi Larson from the Vaccine Confidence Initiative on how to most effectively, persuasively communicate about vaccines, so as to address people's fears and build confidence with those who are feeling hesitant. So this is available already, and we're rolling it out through a number of programs, webinars, etc. Tina, last but not least, would you like to come in and tell us what you're hoping for, what you're planning for in 2021?
Thank you. Maybe if I just say I do a +1 across everything that everyone else has said. As I was thinking through, as I was listening, maybe not to duplicate some of the things, maybe I'll complement. And one thing before I talk about our plans, just because it caught me, and it's something that we've been discussing, several people have touched on. Keep in mind that analogies of virus and infodemic are useful, but they also end at some point. And this is why I was also mentioning that the human behavior and action, and linking to human action in offline, that's where they end. So you have a virus that doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care which host it affects. But infodemic, so information and especially misinformation, it actually does prey on people that are more susceptible, more vulnerable, and are more plugged into certain kinds of social networks. And that's the human factor that is built, and gets built out of the architecture of the information ecosystem that we work in. That's very difficult to counter. and effect. And this is why we really need to put more effort on building evidence and measuring. We actually don't know to what is the extent of the infodemic. We don't know what each individual person in a community that is using their phone is actually seeing. We don't know what exactly people see on different platforms that they're in, and we also don't know what they see when they're using closed messaging apps. We need to be better we need to get better at measurement, having better tools, better metrics, because that's going to help us design better interventions. And until we do, we'll all be vulnerable to the COVID-19 and the infodemic. So that will allow us, better measurement is going to allow us to build better resilience to the infodemic and misinformation in communities and in people. And that's why I totally agree with the need to build literacy on many different levels. Now, Melissa, you mentioned COVID-19 vaccine. We know from previous experience on vaccine demand that there are many aspects that affect people's decision to take a vaccine. So until a vaccine or vaccines are widely available to the public, are widely accepted by the public, we continue to be at risk of both the infodemic and the pandemic. What we know from previous experience in public health is that messages alone do not achieve health behaviors, and also not vaccine demand. So the challenge for us is really how do we actually provide services, including vaccines, that are worthy of people's trust? So not that we are actually pushing messages to promote trust, but how are we actually building the systems and health services that people can trust? So this is just my editorial. I think this is really been a great conversation. Now, what we will do at WHO in 2021, this goes along the call for action that I mentioned earlier, the 50 actions that different parts of society can take in order to help manage the infodemic. And a part of it is definitely going to focus much more on new and more measurements of the infodemic, including the burden of disease due to the infodemic. We will work with our colleagues in UN and academia and more widely to establish norms and standards around digital social listening of offline and offline spaces, and what evidence-based actions we can derive for them. But it's equally important to develop the infodemic manager profession. So we'll be finalizing a competency framework to establish the functional and professional basis of an infodemic manager profession. We're looking at how we can better understand the fact-checking environment. How could we perhaps establish a global network of health claim fact-checkers that we can activate in health emergencies? And I absolutely underscore what many of you mentioned. We need to work with the UN family and other multilateral organizations on almost like a joint roadmap, or how we interface together so that we reinforce through synergies, so that because we're all really affected by the infodemic, and we need to be finding ways how we fulfill our missions with the best possible cooperation. So thank you. This has been really interesting.
This is Tina. Just a final question: do you foresee that this is a new job title at WHO, infodemic officer?
Yes, actually, we are establishing an emergency roster of infodemic managers. This is actually one of the outcomes of the training that we just recently conducted. And in reality, really, infodemic response is so multidisciplinary. We need communications colleagues, we need public health colleagues, we need data scientists, we need social scientists, epidemiologists, whatever the title is. What we need to recognize is that we need to bring in these skills into many different roles within our organizations, within society, including, individual people's literacy in how to recognize misinformation and how to better use health information. So whatever the title is, we need to recognize the multidisciplinary nature of the skill set required to tackle this, and it requires cooperation and partnership.
Excellent. I think that is an incredibly important skill set as we move forward, and also recognition of the importance of communications, of measurement, and all of the whole spectrum of what is involved. Obviously, your point about we cannot overcome a pandemic just with good messages is important. We all have to have good services and good science, and that is really key. I think I just want to thank everybody for your contributions to this very insightful discussion, and for all of those of you who've tuned in and listened and contributed with your questions. I believe there's still some questions that we didn't answer. We didn't have it in the format of the live chat, but if I can indulge our panelists to have a look at the questions that were answered by or asked by members of the public who tuned in. If you could take the time, if you see a question that's relevant to your work, to answer those questions or provide links so that they can delve into the research that you've already conducted. Thank you very much, everyone, and stay safe and all the best.